Y con eso, como lo había dicho antes, le daré la palabra al señor Wheaton, quien presentará su caso a favor de un dictador supremo celestial, también conocido como Dios. Señor Wheaton, ¿está listo? El atrio es suyo.
Los ateos dicen que nadie puede probar la existencia de Dios, y tienen razón. Pero yo digo que nadie puede refutar que Dios existe. Pero la única forma de debatir este asunto es observando la evidencia disponible. Y es lo que vamos a hacer. Pondremos a Dios en un juicio. Con el profesor Radisson como fiscal y yo como el abogado defensor. Y ustedes como el jurado. La mayoría de cosmólogos están de acuerdo con que el universo empezó hace 13.7 billones de años en un evento conocido como la Gran Explosión. Ahora, analicemos la descripción del físico ganador del premio Nobel Steven Weinberg de cómo habría sido la Gran Explosión y, ya que él es ateo, podemos estar seguros de que no hay ninguna inclinación religiosa en su descripción. Al principio, hubo una explosión y en 3 minutos, 98% de la materia que hay o habrá se produjo. El universo apareció. Por 2500 años, la mayoría de científicos estuvieron de acuerdo con Aristóteles, con la idea de que el universo siempre ha existido sin inicio o final. Pero la Biblia no está de acuerdo. En 1920, el astrónomo belga Georges Lemaitre, teísta, que de hecho...
¿Qué es un teísta?
Un teísta es alguien que cree en la existencia de Dios. Dijo que todo el universo saltó a la existencia en un billonésimo de segundo. De la nada, en un inimaginable destello de luz. Así es como esperaría que el universo respondiera si Dios hubiera dado la instrucción en Génesis 1:3 que exista la luz.
At the Mount Wilson Observatory overlooking Los Angeles, astronomer Edwin Hubble studied light from distant galaxies. Hubble determined that galaxies beyond our Milky Way were moving away from us at a speed proportional to their distance from the Earth. The more distant the galaxy, the faster it is receding. Hubble's landmark discovery led most astronomers and physicists, including Albert Einstein, to a similar conclusion. If the universe is continually expanding, then at earlier points in its history, it must have been smaller and denser.
I think a good way to visualize this is to imagine that the history of the universe has somehow been photographed and made into a movie that we could play on a projector. As the projector runs forward, we watch the universe as it continually expands. But if the projector were to be stopped and were switched into reverse to make the movie run backward, then instead of watching the galaxies move farther and farther apart from each other, we'd see them draw closer and closer together.
As you trace this expansion back in time, the universe grows denser and denser and denser until finally the entire known universe is contracted down to a state of infinite density, which marked the beginning of the universe. At this point, which cosmologists call the singularity, all matter and energy, physical space and time themselves came into being. This literally represents the origin of the universe from nothing. So the startling implication of Hubble's discovery was the temporal finitude of the universe, that the universe had an absolute beginning at some point in the finite past.
During the second half of the 20th century, other discoveries also pointed to a universe with a beginning. These images of the cosmic microwave background radiation document what most scientists now believe is the remnant heat generated during the universe's early history. Background radiation is found throughout the cosmos and indicates its expansion from a sudden, perhaps violent moment in time. This evidence for a finite universe has reaffirmed the conclusion of an ancient philosophical deduction. It is called the Kalam cosmological argument.
The Kalam argument is deceptively simple in its formulation. It consists of basically 3 steps. Premise 1 is that whatever begins to exist has a cause. Something cannot come into being uncaused out of absolutely nothing. Premise 2 is that the universe began to exist. And the remarkable development that has occurred is that for the first time, we now have solid scientific evidence for the truth of that second premise, that the universe began to exist. And from those 2 premises, it follows logically, therefore, the universe has a cause of its existence. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause of its existence. And that points to a reality beyond the universe, a transcendent reality beyond space and time, and therefore non-physical and immaterial, which created the universe out of nothing and brought it into being.
The implications of a finite universe, coupled with other discoveries of modern cosmology, have led many scientists to unmistakably theological conclusions.
There is no ground for supposing that matter and energy existed before and were suddenly galvanized into action. It is simpler to postulate creation ex nihilo, divine will constituting nature from nothingness.
The chain of events leading to man commenced suddenly and sharply, at a definite moment in time, in a flash of energy and light.
We can't understand the universe in any clear way without the supernatural.
Supernatural creation of the universe in a flash of energy and light. You know, it sounds an awful lot like the first chapter of Genesis to me. Today, the vast majority of even the most skeptical astronomers and cosmologists believe that the universe had a beginning. This belief isn't based on some theological doctrine. It's based on scientific evidence. And I think if we follow the evidence wherever it points clearly and powerfully and persuasively in the direction of a creator.
En otras palabras, el origen del universo apareció como se esperaría después de leer Génesis y por 2500 años. La Biblia tiene razón y la ciencia está equivocada.
Lo más rápido.
Todo apunta a un Dios que lo creó. Verán, en el mundo real no se ven cosas que se salgan de la nada, pero los ateos quieren hacer una excepción en esta regla. Específicamente en el universo y...
Pero en su libro El espejismo de Dios, Richard Dawkins dice que si me dices que Dios creó el universo, entonces tengo el derecho a preguntar quién creó a Dios.
La pregunta de Dawkins solo tiene sentido en términos de un Dios que ha sido creado. No tiene sentido en términos de un Dios no creado. ¿Qué es la clase de Dios en el que creen? Incluso dejando a Dios fuera de la ecuación, tengo el derecho de devolverle la pregunta al señor Dawkins y decir... Si el universo te creó, ¿quién creó el universo?
Now, Dawkins, his major argument in his book, The God Delusion, is this. He says, but just wait. You see, if you claim that God created the universe, logically you will have to ask, who created God? You've heard that argument, yes? And then you will have to ask, who created the God that created the God that created the God that created, and so on, back forever, which is nonsense.
Si una criatura creó a Dios, esa criatura también fue creada. Aristóteles, en su lógica, discutía, debe haber una realidad que causa, pero no es causada, o un ser que se mueve, pero no movido. ¿Por qué? porque si hay una regresión infinita de causas, entonces por definición el proceso entero nunca podría comenzar.
So there is no God. I was staggered when I read that argument. I get it sometimes in schools. I didn't expect to find it from Professor Dawkins. Why not? Well, think about it logically. The question, who created God, has a hidden assumption built into it. Let's abstract from it one level. If I ask, who or what created X? What's the assumption? The assumption is that X was created, obviously. So if you ask who created God, you're assuming God was created. But what if he wasn't? As the Bible claims that he's eternal. Your question doesn't apply. Full stop. It is only a question that is valid for created gods. And you will notice that Dawkins' book is not called The Created Gods Delusion, because that's obvious to everybody that created gods are a delusion. It's interesting, I debated him on these things, and by the way, you can see these debates on my website, johnlennox.org, and I said to him, you think this question is valid? Well, in a sense it is. For instance, I said to him, you believe the universe created you. So let me ask you your question. Who created your creator? I've waited 9 years for an answer, but I haven't got it yet. It's a non-question, and yet it's the heart of his argument. I find that quite striking.
Ven, tanto teístas como ateos están agobiados por contestar la misma pregunta de cómo iniciaron las cosas. Lo que espero que entiendan de esto es que no hay que cometer suicidio intelectual para creer en un creador tras la creación, y en la medida que descarten a Dios, se verán obligados a encontrar una increíble explicación de cómo las cosas iniciaron.
Me imagino que estás satisfecho con tu presentación. Veo que astutamente evadiste el hecho de que Stephen Hawking, el científico más famoso del mundo y no es teísta, recientemente estuvo a favor de un universo autodiseñado.
No lo evadí, simplemente...
Simplemente no lo sabías. Bien, veamos lo que el profesor Hawking, profesor lucasiano de física de Cambridge, quien ahora ocupa la silla usada por Sir Isaac Newton, tiene que decir sobre el origen del universo. Y cito, ya que hay una ley como la gravedad, el universo puede y se creará de la nada. Creación espontánea es la razón, hay algo en lugar de nada. Por eso es que el universo existe, nosotros existimos. No es necesario invocar a Dios para tener al universo en movimiento. Final de la cita. Nunca ibas a mencionar su comentario, pero su opinión se mantiene. ¿Qué respondes?
No sé.
¿No sabes? Pinché el globo de todo tu argumento con un solo alfiler y... ¿tú no lo sabes? Oh.
Señor, me gustaría decirle que tengo la respuesta perfecta, pero no quebranta mi fe.
Oh, ok. Así que el más grande cerebro científico de toda la historia dice que Dios no es necesario, pero un estudiante de primer semestre dice, oh, sí lo es. Wow, ¿sabes? Va a ser una decisión muy difícil. Pues estaré pendiente la próxima semana. Se acabó la clase.
Última clase me hicieron una pregunta que no pude contestar. Como el profesor Radisson dijo, Stephen Hawking es agnóstico. También escribió un libro llamado El Gran Diseño, en donde dice lo siguiente. Gracias a una ley como la gravedad, el universo puede y se creará de la nada. Y para ser honesto, No sabía cómo refutarlo. Después de todo, es cierto que Hawking es un genio. Pero el profesor John Lennox, quien enseña matemáticas y filosofía, ha demostrado que no hay ni uno, ni dos, sino 3 errores de lógica en esa simple frase y se reduce a un razonamiento circular. Hawking básicamente está diciendo que el universo existe porque necesitaba existir, y como el universo necesitaba existir, se creó a sí mismo. Es como si les dijera que la carne enlatada es la mejor que haya existido porque en toda la historia no hay comida que sea mejor. Quizá me vean extraño y les digo que nunca he probado nada más. Y tienen razón, lo estoy ratificando. Pero cuando Hawking afirma que el universo se creó a sí mismo porque así debía ser, y luego dice que tiene una explicación de cómo y por qué fue creado, no reconocemos que está haciendo lo mismo. Pero así es. Continuando con Lennox, sandeces se quedan en sandeces, aunque sean dichas por un famoso científico. Y el público asuma que son declaraciones de la ciencia.
Este es el tope de la arrogancia. ¿Me estás diciendo que tú, un estudiante, afirma que Stephen Hawking está mal?
No. Lo que digo es que John Lennox, profesor de matemáticas y filosofía, encontró que las razones del profesor Hawking son incorrectas.
I mentioned that Stephen Hawking rejects God because of gravity. Let's see how he does it. I gave you the central argument of the God delusion, which is a non-question. Here's the central argument of the grand design as I come to my conclusion. Hawking writes, because there is a law of gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. Now, when I first read that, I thought, excuse me? Because there is a law of gravity, because there is something, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. Flat contradiction, number 1. Number 2, because there is a law of gravity. He doesn't say because gravity exists, and this opens a window into another confusion. What is the status of law? Does it create things? Well, of course not. I once asked another famous atheist in Oxford, Peter Atkins, professor of physical chemistry, what created the universe? And he said mathematics. And I'm afraid I was so surprised I started to laugh, which was very rude. And he said, why do you laugh? Well, I said, Peter, I am a mathematician, and I must be honest with you, that's the most stupid thing I've ever heard. He said, why? Well, I said, let me keep it simple. 1 + 1 = 2. Did that ever put 2 euros in your pocket? Just as a little aside, ladies and gentlemen, have you heard of the financial crisis? Do you know what caused that partially? Some people believed that doing mathematics could create money. But mathematics doesn't create anything, it describes. Newton's laws of motion will describe the movement of a billiard ball, a little bit anyway, but they won't cause the ball to move. People with a cue do that. And this is a huge confusion that the laws of nature are causes. They're not. They're descriptions of what is there. So a law of gravity is meaningless if gravity isn't already present. So that's problem number 2. And here comes problem number 3. The universe will create itself. Well, if I say X creates Y, what does that mean? It roughly means if you've got X, you'll get Y. And if I say X creates X, what does that mean? It means if you've got X, you'll get X. And what does that mean? Well, it means that nonsense remains nonsense even if scientists write it. This is the central argument of Hawking's book, Rejecting God. It's got 3 distinct levels of absurdity or self-contradiction in it. I find that very worrying. Now, don't misunderstand me, ladies and gentlemen. Stephen Hawking I admire greatly, as a mathematician and theoretical physicist. He's a genius. He was a little bit ahead of me in Cambridge, and he's light years ahead of me in his brain power. But I'm afraid in these statements, he is proving the truth of what Einstein wrote years ago. Outside his field, the scientist is a poor philosopher.
Y si no soporta mi desacuerdo con Hawking, le sugiero que vaya a la página 5 de su libro, en donde insiste en que la filosofía está muerta. Y si está tan seguro de la infalibilidad de Hawking y la filosofía realmente está muerta, entonces no hay necesidad de esta clase. Damas y caballeros del jurado, desde hace 150 años los darwinistas han dicho que Dios es innecesario para explicar la existencia del hombre y que la evolución reemplaza a Dios. Pero la evolución solo nos dice lo que sucede una vez que se tiene vida. Así que, ¿de dónde viene ese algo que tiene vida? Darwin nunca lo dijo, quizás supuso que un rayo cayó en una piscina con los químicos correctos. Lotería, un ser vivo. Pero no es tan simple.
In 1953, Stanley Miller, a graduate chemistry student, tried to demonstrate how life first emerged on Earth. Miller attempted to reproduce the Earth's early atmosphere. He pumped hydrogen, methane, ammonia, and a small amount of water vapor into a maze of glassware. Then sparked the gases with electrical discharges to simulate lightning. After 5 days, he discovered what he had hoped for: a few simple amino acids, the basic building blocks of living organisms, had collected in the dark residue at the bottom of the glass. Many hailed Miller's experiment as proof that essential components of life could have formed in the oceans of the Earth billions of years ago.
The philosophical implications of Miller's experiment were instantly obvious to me. And for me, it was a eureka moment, because I heard this and I thought, wait a minute. If you can show scientifically that life can emerge without any outside assistance, if life can emerge just from naturalistic circumstances, then God was out of a job. From there, the acceptance of Darwinian evolution, and full-blown atheism for that matter, was pretty easy. Because if living organisms could emerge by themselves out of this primordial soup without the assistance of any kind of a god or supernatural intervention, then they certainly could develop naturally over the eons into more and more complex creatures, just as Charles Darwin theorized in his book On the Origin of Species. As biologist Jonathan Wells explained to me, Miller's experiment has now been thoroughly discredited.
Stanley Miller put together a glass apparatus, and in that apparatus he put a mixture of gases that people at the time thought reflected the atmosphere of the early Earth. And those gases were methane, ammonia, hydrogen, and water vapor. But then the professional opinion of what was there on the early Earth changed. In the 60s, geochemists revised their hypothesis and decided that the hydrogen, being very light, would have escaped into outer space. The Earth's gravity isn't strong enough to hold it. And probably the early Earth's atmosphere then consisted of what we now see coming out of volcanoes today, namely carbon dioxide, nitrogen, and water vapor. Well, if the early Earth's atmosphere consisted of those gases, then Stanley Miller's experiment would not work. In fact, he himself tried it with those gases, and he found that he couldn't produce any amino acids at all. So the experiment falls apart once you use a more realistic mixture of gases in the apparatus.
Miller's test has been repeated many times using the correct atmospheric components. The results are always the same. The amino acids that generated so much enthusiasm in 1953 do not appear.
Even if Miller's experiment were valid, you're still light years away from making life. It comes down to this. No matter how many molecules you can produce with early Earth conditions, plausible conditions, you're still nowhere near producing a living cell. And here's how I know. If I take a sterile test tube
and I put in a little bit of fluid with just the right salts, just the right balance of acidity and alkalinity, just the right temperature, the perfect solution for a living cell. And I put in it one living cell. This cell is alive. It has everything it needs for life. Now I take a sterile needle and I poke that cell, and all its stuff leaks out into this test tube. You have in this nice little test tube all the molecules you need for a living cell. Not just the pieces of the molecules, but the molecules themselves. And you cannot make a living cell out of them. You can't put Humpty Dumpty back together again. So what makes you think that a few amino acids dissolved in the ocean are going to give you a living cell? It's totally unrealistic.
Verán, Darwin afirma que el ancestro de todas las cosas vivientes vino de una sola cosa. Un organismo simple que se reprodujo y se modificó con el tiempo en una forma de vida más compleja. Por eso es que después de contemplar su propia teoría, Darwin pronunció su famosa declaración: Natura non fucking saltum, lo que significa la naturaleza no salta. Y como el famoso autor Lee Strobel dijo, si puedes imaginar los 3.8 billones de años que los científicos dicen que la vida ha estado entre nosotros en un día de 24 horas, en el espacio de 90 segundos, la mayoría de grupos de animales de repente aparecieron en las formas que actualmente tienen. No como Darwin predijo, sino en términos de evolución, casi instantáneamente.
Perhaps the most damaging blow to Darwin's theory is the fossil record. If all living organisms have descended from the same primitive life form, then the rock strata of the Earth should be filled with the fossilized remains of animals that were once part of a great evolutionary chain. A chain of small biological modifications, ultimately leading to a spectacular diversity of life. Yet, after 2 centuries of research, highlighted by excavations in southern China, the multitude of transitional experiments, or missing links, that should exist are conspicuous only by their absence. The most graphic example of this void in the fossil record is a geological era known as the Cambrian explosion.
The branching tree pattern of Darwin's theory is actually not seen anywhere in the fossil record unless we impose it with our own minds. So the Cambrian explosion is the most dramatic refutation of the Tree of Life.
The Cambrian explosion of life was a dramatic episode in geological history. Usually dated at about 530 million years ago, the exquisitely preserved Cambrian fossils reveal that the body plans for virtually every major animal phyla appeared, not gradually and slowly as Darwin had speculated, but instead with astonishing suddenness.
If we imagine the whole history of life on Earth taking place in one 24-hour period, the current standard estimates for the origin of life put it at about 3.8 billion years ago, let's say 4 billion. So if we start the clock then, our 24-hour clock, 6 hours, nothing but these simple single-celled organisms appear, the same sort that we saw in the beginning. 12 hours, same thing. 18 hours, same thing. 3/4 of the day has passed, and all we have are these simple, single-celled organisms. Then at about the 21st hour, in the space of about 2 minutes, boom, most of the major animal forms appear in the form that they currently have in the present. And many of them persist to the present, and we have them with us today. Less than 2 minutes out of a 24-hour period. That's how sudden the Cambrian explosion was.
In a geological instant, the animal kingdom leaped from small, relatively simple organisms to extraordinary creatures with spinal cords, compound eyes, and articulated limbs. The record of this explosion of life looks nothing like Darwin's slowly branching tree.
Darwin's theory is that there's a tree of life, where you have one organism diverging into many other organisms and big differences appearing at the top. What we really see is from here up. This does not exist in the fossil record. If I were using a botanical illustration, it would be a lawn. with separate blades of grass sprouting independently of each other. And those would be the phyla. Now within each phylum, there is subsequent diversification, but even there, I don't see the branches connecting that would make them a tree of life. As scientists, it's not our job to force the evidence into a theory that just doesn't fit it. And so I have absolutely no desire or reason to uphold Darwin's theory at this point.
I think what we're seeing today is a series of scientific discoveries that are opening the eyes of more and more scientists to say, wait a minute, I can no longer believe that pure naturalistic processes can account for the origin and diversity of life. There must be something else here.
The challenges to Darwinian theory have led more than 600 scientists with PhDs from major universities throughout the world to sign a document titled A Scientific Dissent from Darwinism. It reads in part, "We are skeptical of the claims for the ability of random mutation and natural selection to account for the complexity of life."
These are scientists with PhDs from Stanford and Berkeley and University of Chicago and Cambridge, major universities, who've looked hard and fast at the evidence and have walked away saying, I am not convinced. Maybe there's another explanation. Personally, the negative evidence forced me to conclude that Darwinism would require a blind leap of faith that I just had no good reason.
Así que la naturaleza no salta, se convierte en la naturaleza dio un gran salto. ¿Cómo los teístas explican tanta información biológica? Y Dios dijo, que las aguas se llenen de seres vivientes y que vuelen aves sobre la tierra en la expansión de los cielos. Dios creó los monstruos marinos, los diversos seres vivientes que llenan las aguas y todas las especies de aves. Y Dios vio que esto era bueno. Génesis 1:20. En otras palabras, la creación sucedió porque Dios lo dijo. Y lo que parece para nosotros un proceso oscuro sin guía, pudo realmente ser controlado de principio a fin. El mal. Se dice que el mal es el arma más potente del ateísmo contra la fe cristiana. Después de todo, la existencia del mal nos lleva a una pregunta. ¿Y si Dios es tan bueno y tan poderoso, por qué permite que el mal exista? La respuesta a esto es muy simple. Libre albedrío. Dios permite que el mal exista por el libre albedrío. Desde el punto de vista cristiano, Dios tolera el mal en este mundo por un tiempo para que un día todos los que eligieron amarlo estén con Él en el cielo, apartados del mal, pero con el libre albedrío intacto. En otras palabras, la intención de Dios con el mal es destruirlo un día.
Oh, qué conveniente. Un día me desharé de todo el mal del mundo, pero hasta ese momento tendrán que lidiar con las guerras, holocaustos, tsunamis, pobreza, hambruna y sida. Que se diviertan.
Years ago at the University of Nottingham, when I'd finished a talk, when a person stood up, or a student stood up and shouted from the floor, and he said, you know, there's too much of evil in this world, there can't be a God. There's too much of evil and suffering in this world. And raised it, and I said to him, why don't I make it clear first why you are asking this question and what your assumptions are. I said, when you say there's evil, aren't you assuming there's such a thing as good? He paused and he said, yes. I said, when you say there's such a thing as good, aren't you assuming there's such a thing as a moral law on the basis of which to differentiate between good and evil? He struggled with this and we interacted, and finally he said, yeah, there would have to be an objective moral standard from which to differentiate between good and evil. I said, when you say there's a moral law, you must posit a moral lawgiver. But that's whom you're trying to disprove and not prove. Because if there's no moral lawgiver, there's no moral law. If there's no moral law, there's no good. If there's no good, there's no evil. What is your question? And he looked at me, paused, and he said, what then am I asking you? Now, this was years ago. I said, I know what you're asking, man. I'm not trying to make it hard for you. It's an existentially felt question that often doesn't examine the logical presuppositions within this. God has to remain in the paradigm for the question to be real, and therefore the answer has to come from what God's purposes and what God's description is all about reality. There's a young gal in Georgia, where I live. I live in Atlanta. And her first name is Ashlyn. And one day her mother was on a television program discussing a strange problem that she has, which is called CIPA, congenital insensitivity to pain with anhidrosis. She cannot feel pain, and her sweat glands don't work. The problem may sound good, you don't feel any pain. But the reality is, if she steps on a nail while she's on the sports field, it could puncture the skin, create an infection, and nobody could be even aware of it. The mother said the problems it has created in her life for what this malady brings into her body. She says, I pray one prayer every night. God, please let my daughter help to feel pain. She could put her hand on a burner and not know that her hand is burning. Now, my question is this. If in our finite existence we can see the role of pain to warn us that something is wrong, is it impossible for God in His infinite wisdom to allow pain in our lives to help us know that something is wrong? Pain is spelt with moral connotations in the human framework. That is because we are moral beings. Therefore, the answer has to come from within a moral, spiritual framework as well. The question assumes moral reasoning, and that can only be assumed if God is in the paradigm, not outside of it.
Luego nos enseñará sobre el absolutismo moral.
Pero ¿por qué no? El profesor Radisson, quien claramente es ateo, no cree en absolutismo moral, pero en su programa dice que planea hacernos un examen en la última semana. Apuesto a que si consigo una A en el examen haciendo trampa, inmediatamente empezará a sonar como un cristiano insistiendo que está mal hacerlo. ¿Y qué base tendría él? Si el propósito de mis acciones es lograr el éxito, entonces, ¿por qué no podría hacerlo? Para los cristianos, el punto de la moralidad, lo que constituye lo bueno y lo malo, es una línea directa que nos conduce hacia Dios.
Oh, estás diciendo que necesitamos a Dios para ser morales, que una moral atea no es posible.
No, pero sin Dios no hay una razón para ser moral. No habría un estándar para el comportamiento moral.
If God does not exist, then objective moral values do not exist. Many theists and atheists alike concur on this point. For example, the late J.L. Mackie of Oxford University, one of the most eminent atheists of our day, admitted if there are objective values, they make the existence of a God more probable than it would have been without them. Thus, we have a defensible argument from morality to the existence of a God. But in order to avoid God's existence, Mackie therefore denied that objective moral values exist. He wrote, "It is easy to explain this moral sense as a natural product of biological and social evolution." Professor Michael Roos, a philosopher of science at the University of Guelph, agrees. He explains, "Morality is a biological adaptation, no less than our hands and feet and teeth. Considered as a rationally justifiable set of claims about an objective something, ethics is illusory. I appreciate that when somebody says, 'Love thy neighbor as thyself,' they think they are referring above and beyond themselves. Nevertheless, such reference is truly without foundation. Morality is just an aid to survival and reproduction, and any deeper meaning is illusory." Friedrich Nietzsche, the great atheist of the last century who proclaimed the death of God, understood that the death of God meant the destruction of all meaning and value in life. I think that Friedrich Nietzsche was right. But we've got to be very careful here. The question here is not, must we believe in God in order to live moral lives? I'm not claiming that we must. Nor is the question, can we recognize objective moral values without believing in God? I think that we can. Rather, the question is, if God does not exist, do objective moral values exist? Like Mackie and Roos, I just don't see any reason to think that in the absence of God, the morality evolved by Homo sapiens is objective. After all, if there is no God, then what's so special about human beings? They're just accidental byproducts of nature, which have evolved relatively recently on an infinitesimal speck of dust, lost somewhere in a hostile and mindless universe in which are doomed to perish individually and collectively in a relatively short time. On the atheistic view, some actions, say rape, may not be socially advantageous, and so in the course of human development has become taboo. But that does absolutely nothing to prove that rape is really wrong. On the atheistic view, apart from the social consequences, there's nothing really wrong with your raping someone. Thus, without God, there is no absolute right and wrong which imposes itself on our conscience. But the problem is that objective values do exist, and deep down we all know it. There is no more reason to deny the existence of objective moral values than the existence of objective physical objects in the world. Actions like rape, torture, and child abuse aren't just socially unacceptable behavior. They're moral abominations. Some things, at least, are really wrong. Similarly, love, equality, and self-sacrifice are really good. But if objective values cannot exist without God, and objective values do exist, then it follows logically and inescapably that God exists. Moral argument. Here he says that you have to prove that people would behave better if they believed in God. That's not the argument. I hope that's clear to everyone. The argument is that without God as a transcendent foundation for moral values, we're simply lost in socio-cultural relativism. Who are you to judge that the Nazi ethic was wrong? Who are you to judge that the ethic of ancient Hinduism was wrong? Who are you to judge that the Afrikaner apartheid is wrong? This is all just the result of socio-cultural evolution, and there is no transcendent objective standard apart from God, and that's what God delivers for us. The point is that on atheism, there are no moral obligations for anybody to fulfill. In nature, whatever is right, and Mr. Hitchens is unable to provide any sort of objective foundation for moral values. Massimo Pigliucci is a philosopher of biology. This is what he has to say. He says, on atheism, there is no such thing as objective morality. Morality in human cultures has evolved, and what is moral for you might not be moral for the guy next door, and certainly is not moral for the guy across the ocean. And what makes you think that your personal morality is the one and everybody else is wrong? What we call homicide or rape, he said, is very, very common among different kinds of animals. Lions, for example, commit infanticide on a regular basis. Now, are these kinds of acts to be condoned? I don't even know what that means, because the lion doesn't understand what morality is. Morality, he says, is an invention of human beings. It's just a convention that human beings have adopted to live together, but it has no objectivity. And that's what I offer Mr. Hitchens tonight, is a solid, transcendent foundation for the moral values that I think he so desperately wants to affirm. But if objective values cannot exist without God, and objective values do exist, then it follows logically and inescapably that God exists.
Para los cristianos, mentir, robar, hacer trampa en un examen para lograr una calificación que no merezco está prohibido. Pero si Dios no existiera, según Dostoyevsky, este es el punto. Ahora, si Dios no existe, entonces todo es permitido. Y no solo es permitido, sino sin sentido. Si el profesor Radisson tiene razón, entonces nuestra lucha, nuestro debate, lo que decidamos aquí no tiene sentido. Nuestras vidas, nuestras muertes no serán diferentes a las de un pez dorado.
Oh, qué ridiculez. Después de toda tu charla, ¿quieres decir que solo hay una opción? Creer o no creer.
Así es. Eso es todo. De eso se trata todo. La diferencia entre su posición y la mía es que usted les quitó su elección. Les exigió que eligieran la casilla marcada con no creo.
Sí, porque quiero liberarlos. Porque la religión es como un virus mental que los padres han heredado a sus hijos. Y el cristianismo es el peor de todos. Lentamente se mete en tu vida cuando estás débil, enfermo o indefenso.
¿La religión es una enfermedad?
Sí. Sí, infecta todo. Es la enemiga de la razón.
¿Razón?
I think it is very rational to believe in God. In fact, I think that God is the foundation of rationality. My major problem with atheism is that it undermines rationality because it tries to explain the universe from the bottom up. In other words, in a reductionistic way, it tries to reduce everything to physics and chemistry. But I am not convinced at all that you can reduce questions of meaning to physics and chemistry. I don't think physics and chemistry have that kind of explanatory power. The obvious example of that is the moment we see anything in a language, we infer intelligence. And the very fact that we can do science is, for me, one of the biggest evidences that there is a God behind the universe. That was the motivation of Copernicus and Kepler and Galileo and Newton. They believed in a rational order that could be understood, at least in part, by a scientific mind, because they believed in a lawgiver behind the universe. So I think it's really the other way around, that atheism is not consistent with doing science, whereas theism is completely consistent with doing science.
Profesor, usted dejó la razón hace mucho tiempo. Lo que nos está enseñando aquí no es filosofía, ni siquiera es ateísmo. Lo que nos está enseñando aquí es antiteísmo, no es suficiente. Necesita que todos no creamos como usted.
¿Por qué no admites la verdad? ¿Quieres enredarlos en tu primitiva superstición?
Lo que quiero es que tomen su propia decisión. Eso es lo que Dios quiere.
No sabes cuánto voy a disfrutar reprobándote.
Pero ¿a quién realmente quiere reprobar, profesor? ¿A mí o a Dios? ¿Odia a Dios?
Ni siquiera es una pregunta.
Ok. ¿Por qué odia a Dios?
Esto es ridículo.
¿Por qué odia a Dios? Responda a la pregunta. ¿Ha visto la ciencia y los argumentos? La ciencia avala su existencia, conoce la verdad. ¿Por qué lo odia? ¿Por qué? Esta es una pregunta simple, profesor. ¿Por qué odia a Dios?
Porque Él me quitó todo lo que era importante para mí. Sí, yo odio a Dios. Todo lo que siento por Él es odio.
¿Cómo puede odiar a Dios si no existe?
No probaste nada.
Quizá no. Ellos deben elegir. ¿Está Dios muerto?
Dios no está muerto.
Dios no está muerto.
Dios no está muerto. Dios no está muerto. Dios no está muerto.
Dios no está muerto.
Dios no está muerto.
Dios no está muerto.
Dios no está muerto.